Hi, John Allison. Good to see you. Good to have you with us. Welcome all of you, others who are coming to watch. Tonight we're going to read the chapter 9 called In the Witch's House. But before I do that, I want to tell you a story. I'm wearing a special cross tonight. It's a Russian cross that I got in St. Petersburg, Russia. It's called, I hope you all can see it, it's a crucifix. And it's very primitive in its design, and it's an old believer's cross. I found it just after the fall of the Soviet Union in Russia. It was in a bin with some reproductions. I love this one because the top had been broken off. There was something, I think I mentioned it before, I think I did last Sunday, but there was something a little bit like Veronica's veil with Christ's face on it above the corpus at the crossing. And as you remember, the bottom angular crossing points to the thief that the only person Jesus ever said, "Today you will be with me in paradise." And below his feet is the tomb of Adam. There's a skull. Anyway, we are Adam's sons and daughters. And tonight we're going to read about the witch's house. But I wanted to tell you a story. I was walking this morning, and it's funny how places and signs and symbols trigger memories. This may not be something that happens to you, but it happens to me a lot. This morning I was taking a walk over Winchester in a regional park, and I stumbled on a beautiful memorial set up by the Rolling Thunder. And I remember, all of a sudden I remembered my daughters when they were young, and all of us going down to the bridge near a house in Arlington and watching Rolling Thunder go in on 66. It's a very sad thing that Rolling Thunder is no longer able to do it. They've run out of money, and many of the veterans are getting older. They announced, I think, way before this pandemic that they were not going to be able to do it again. Anyway, this memorial is really lovely. There's several stones, all commemorating different wars that veterans were in and who died in. And I came across, in each one of them, in the front it says, "Gone but not forgotten." And I just thought how poignant that is for us today, because there are many people who are dying alone because of this pandemic, and we must pray that they not be forgotten. And also I wore this because of persecuted Christians. In spite of the pandemic, there are people being put in jail all over the world for their faith, not just Christian faith, but many faiths, and unjust actions and persecutions because of dictatorships. And I'd encourage you, if you have a lot of time, to maybe pray every day for those who are gone but should not be forgotten. The reason that memory came to me was there was a big sign and a flag, Palmia, prisoner of war. And when we used to go to Eureka in the summers when my daughters were little, we'd always pass, I think, somebody can tell me, it was, I think, the town library, and above it, it was either that or the armory. There was a huge Palmia sign with their symbol. And we used to always love to drive by it on the way to grandparents' house. I loved it before we even had children. I loved to go by it. It always reminds me of Eureka, California. I saw today that Sam Omi looked in, and they live. She doesn't live. She lives in Austin, Texas, but her family, her extended family, live in Eureka, and I want to send special greetings to them. I would love to see them again sometime. Anyway, so the Palmia reminded me of wonderful memories, including when the girls were a little bit older and Twala's parents moved out of Eureka up into the woods, into the redwoods, and had 21 acres with a stream going through it and a cabin in the woods with a big wood stove that heated the whole house. And we would just love to go there. And as I told you today and gave you a tour of the children's wing, Twala's dad was very creative with woodworking and things, and there was about halfway down there was an old redwood stump, a huge redwood stump, and so as a joke he put in the redwood stump took a sheet and made a ghost. And every time we would come to meet them, we would all get excited about getting by the spooky tree on our way down. We'd always speed up on our way down to get past the spooky tree. It became a ritual every year. That's how rituals start and how memories are made. And again, let us think about those who are dying and suffering today, wherever they might be. So now we will start chapter 9. In the witch's house. And now, of course, you want to know what happened to Edmund. Remember, they were at dinner, Mr. and Mrs. Beaver. He had eaten his share of the dinner, but he hadn't really enjoyed it because he was thinking all the time about Turkish delight. How many of you boys and girls think about dessert before you finish your dinner? I do. And then there's nothing that spoils the taste of good ordinary food half so much as the memory of bad magic food. It's kind of like candy. And he had heard the conversation and hadn't enjoyed it much either, because he kept on thinking that the others were taking no notice of him. He's feeling sorry for himself. Do you ever feel ignored and sorry for yourself? I have. And they tried to give him the cold shoulder, so he thought. They weren't, but he imagined it. And then he had listened until Mr. Beaver told them about Aslan, and until he had heard the whole arrangement for meeting Aslan at the stone table, It was then that he began very quietly to edge himself under the curtain which hung over the door. For the mention of Aslan gave him a mysterious and horrible feeling, just as it gave the others a mysterious and lovely feeling. Just as Mr. Beaver had been repeating the rhyme about Adam's flesh and Adam's bone, Edmund had been very quietly turning the door handle. And just before Mr. Beaver had begun telling them that the White Witch wasn't really human at all, but half a djinn and half a giantess, Edmund had got outside into the snow and cautiously closed the door behind him without anybody noticing. You mustn't think that even now Edmund was quite so bad that he actually wanted his brother and sisters to be turned into stone. He did want Turkish delight, and to be a prince and later a king, and to pay Peter out for calling him a beast. He couldn't get over that. As for what the witch would do with the others, he didn't want her to be, and he didn't really want her to be particularly nice to them. Certainly not to put them on the same level as himself, but he managed to believe, or pretend he believed, that she wouldn't do anything very bad to them. Because, he said to himself, all these people who say nasty things about her are her enemies, and probably half isn't true. She was jolly nice to me anyway, but much nicer than they are. I expect she is rightful queen, really. Anyway, she'll be better than that awful Aslan. At least that was the excuse he made in his own mind for what he was doing. It wasn't a very good excuse, however, for deep down inside him he really knew that the White Witch was bad and cruel. The first thing he realized when he got outside and found the snow falling all around him was that he had left his coat behind in the beaver's house. And of course there was no chance of going back to get it now. The next thing he realized was that the daylight was almost gone, for it had been nearly 3 o'clock when they sat down to dinner, and the winter days were short. I don't know where you are tonight, but rain is coming back tomorrow and cold fronts coming through, and it feels like winter, and it's dark earlier than usual. Sorry. He hadn't reckoned on this, but he had to make the best of it. So he turned up his collar and shuffled across the top of the dam. Luckily it wasn't slippery since the snow had fallen, to the far side of the river. It was pretty bad when he reached the far side. It was growing darker every minute, and what with that and the snowflakes swirling all around him, he could hardly see 3 feet ahead. And then too there was no road. He kept slipping into drifts of snow and skidding on frozen puddles, tripping over fallen tree trunks and sliding down steep banks, and barking his chins against rocks till he was wet and cold and bruised all over. Boy, Edmund was in a mess. The silence and the loneliness were dreadful. You've been feeling that lately? I do. It's strange to be everything to be so still and silent. In fact, I really think he might have given up the whole plan and gone back and owned up and made friends with the others if he hadn't happened to say to himself, well, when I'm king of Narnia, the first thing I will do is to make decent roads. And of course that set him off thinking about being a king and all other things he would do, and this cheered him up a great deal. He had just settled in his mind what sort of palace he would have and how many cars, and about his private cinema, and when the principal railways would run, and what laws he would make against beavers and dams, and was putting the finishing touches to some scheme for keeping Peter in his place, when the weather changed. First the snow stopped, then a wind sprang up, and it became freezing cold. Brr. Finally the clouds rolled away and the moon came out. It was a full moon shining on all that snow. It made everything almost as bright as day, only the shadows were rather confusing. He would have never found his way if the moon hadn't come out by the time he got to the other river. You remember he had seen when they first arrived at the Beavers a small river flowing into the great one lower down. Smaller river flowing into the great one lower down. He now reached this and turned to follow it up, but the little valley down which it came was much steeper and rockier than the one he had just left, and much more overgrown with bushes, so that he could not have managed it at all in the dark. Even as it was, he got wet. He got wet through, for he had to stoop under the branches, and great loads of snow came sliding off onto his back. And every time this happened, he thought more and more how he hated Peter, just as if this had been all Peter's fault. We love to blame others, don't we? But at last he came to a part where it was more level and the valley opened out. And there on the other side of the river, quite close to him in the middle of a little plain between two hills, he saw what must be the White Witch's house. And the moon was shining brighter than ever. The house was really a castle. It seemed to be all towers, little towers with long pointed spires on them, sharp as needles. They looked like huge dunce's caps or sorcerer's cap, and they shone in the moonlight, and their long shadows looked strange on the snow. Edmund began to be afraid of the house. But it was too late to think of turning back now. He crossed the river on the ice, walked up to the house. There was nothing stirring, not the slightest sound anywhere. Even his own feet made no noise on the deep, newly fallen snow. He walked on, past corner after corner of the house, and past turret after turret to find the door. He had to go right round to the far side before he found it. It was a large arch, but with great iron gates stood wide open. Edmund crept up to the arch and looked inside to the courtyard. There he saw a sight that nearly made his heart stop beating. Just inside the gate, with the moonlight shining on it, stood an enormous lion, crouched as it was ready to spring. And Edmund stood in the shadow of the arch, afraid to go on and afraid to go back, with his knees knocking together. He stood there so long that his teeth would have been chattering with cold, even if they had not been chattering with fear. How long this really lasted, I don't know, but it seemed to Edmund it lasted for hours. Then at last he began to wonder why the lion was standing so still, for it had moved 1 inch since he set his eyes on it. Edmund now ventured a little nearer, still keeping in the shadow of the arch as much as he could. He now saw from the way the lion was standing that it couldn't have been looking at him at all. But supposing it turns its head, thought Edmund. In fact, it was staring at something else. namely a little dwarf who stood with his dwarf to the back of it about 4 feet away. Aha, thought Edmund. When it springs at the dwarf, that will be my chance to escape. But still the lion never moved, nor did the dwarf. And now at last Edmund remembered what the others had said about the White Witch turning people into stone. Perhaps this was only a stone lion, and as soon as he thought of that, he noticed that the lion's back and the top of his head were covered with snow. Of course, it must be only a statue. No living animal would let itself get covered with snow. Then very slowly, with his heart beating as if it would burst, Edmund ventured to go up to the lion. Even now he hardly dared to touch it, but at last he put out his hand very quickly and did. It was cold stone. He had been frightened of a mere statue. He's not a fraidy cat. He feels real danger. The relief which Edmund felt was so great that in spite of the cold, he suddenly got warm all over, down to his toes. And at the same time, there came into his head what seemed a perfectly lovely idea. Probably, he thought, this is the great lion Aslan, and that they were all talking about. She's caught him already and turned him into stone. So that's the end of all their fine ideas about him. Pooh! Who's afraid of Aslan? He stood there gloating over the stone lion, and presently he did something very silly and childish. He took a stump of a lead pencil out of his pocket and scribbled a mustache on the lion's upper lip, and then a pair of spectacles on its eyes. Then he said, "Yeah, silly old Aslan, how do you like being a stone? You thought yourself mighty fine, didn't you? But in spite of the scribbles on its face of the great stone beast, it still looked so terrible and sad and noble staring up in the moonlight, that it did, so much so that Edmund didn't really get any fun out of jeering at it. He turned away and began to cross the courtyard. As he got into the middle of it, he saw that there were dozens of statues all about, standing here and there, rather as the pieces stand on a chessboard when it is halfway through the game. There were stone satyrs, stone wolves, bears and foxes, and a cat on mountains of stone. There were lovely stone shapes that looked like women, but who were really spirits of trees. There was a great shape of a centaur and a winged horse, and a long, lithe creature that Edmund took to be a dragon. They all looked so strange, standing there perfectly lifelike and also perfectly still in the bright, cold moonlight, that it was eerie. It was eerie work crossing the courtyard. Right in the middle stood a huge shape like a man, but as tall as a tree, with a fierce face and shaggy beard, and a great club in its right hand. Even though he knew it was only a stone giant and not a live one, Edmund did not like going past it. Pretty scary, I'd say. He now saw that there was a dim light showing from a doorway on the far side of the courtyard. He went to it, and there was a flight of stone steps going up to an open door. Edmund went up them. Across the threshold lay a great wolf. It's all right, he kept saying to himself. It's only a stone wolf. It can't hurt me. And he raised his leg to step over it. Instantly, the huge creature rose, and all the hair bristling along its back opened a great red mouth and said in a growling voice, "Who's there? Who's there? Stand tall, stranger, and tell me who you are." "If you please, sir," said Edmund, trembling so that he could hardly speak, "my name is Edmund, and I'm the son of Adam that Her Majesty met in the wood the other day, and I've come to bring her the news that my brothers and sisters are now in Narnia, quite close, in the beaver's house. She wanted to see them." "I will tell Her Majesty," said the wolf. Meanwhile, stand still on the threshold as you value your life. Then the wolf vanished into the house. I wonder what happens next. Edmund stood and waited, his fingers aching with cold and his heart pounding in his chest. Presently the grey wolf, Malgrim, the chief of the witches' secret police, came bounding back and said, come in, fortunate favourite of the queen, or else not so fortunate. And Edmund went in, taking great care not to tread on the wolf's paws. He found himself in a long, gloomy hall with many pillars, full as the courtyard had been of statues, so it was full too. The one nearest the door was a little fawn, a very sad expression on its face, and Edmund couldn't help wondering if it might be Lucy's friend. The only light came from a single lamp. Close beside this sat the White Witch. I've come, Your Majesty, said Edmund, rushing eagerly forward. How dare you come along, said the witch in a terrible voice. Did I not tell you to bring the others with you? Please, Your Majesty, said Edmund, I've done the best I can. I brought them quite close. They're in the little house on top of the dam just up the river with Mr. and Mrs. Beaver. A slow, cruel smile came over the witch's face. Is this all your news, she asked. No, Your Majesty, said Edmund, and proceeded to tell her all he had heard before leaving the Beaver's house. What? Aslan? Cried the queen. Aslan? Is this true? If I find you have lied to me... Please, I'm only repeating what they said, stammered Edmund. But the queen, who was no longer attending to him, clapped her hands. Come. Instantly the same dwarf Edmund had seen with her before appeared. Make ready our sledge, ordered the witch, and use the harness without bells. They won't be able to see her or hear her. Well, tomorrow night we'll continue to chapter 10, and it's The Spell Begins to Break. That's going to be fun to hear about. I want to share with you two things before I close. One was about the walk today, and the first was about something I did yesterday talking about our wedding. And I think you might like to see this. This is a picture of Twyla and I. The light isn't really very good, but I wanted to prove to you that our wedding was really quite lovely and beautiful. And we were too. We were young. I miss her a lot. Secondly, today on my walk, I mentioned it this morning. And by the way, if any of you have trouble seeing the tea time today, the actual networks were down. It seems the whole universe is using the internet today. Anyway, it wasn't my reception. Anyway, I took a walk this morning and I thought of Mother Teresa. Under a picnic table cover was a man cooking coffee and his meal with a coffee pot plugged into an outlet that was there. This is outside in Winchester. I forget the name of the park. It's just as you come into Winchester. On the side, on the right, in Pleasant Valley Drive beyond 50. Anyway, I took a long walk and came back, and I said hello to him and asked him if there's anything I could do, because I noticed he had a grocery cart, and it didn't look like he had anything else. He seemed to be homeless. And I talked to him, and he said, well, no, I'm just waiting for a paycheck. And he said, I'm usually here. I'll be here through next Thursday. I said, is there anything I can do? Can I get you some food? Do you need money? What do you need? He said, no, I'm fine. I'm going to pick up a paycheck. And I said, well, I just wanted to let you know when I come back, I'll be glad to help you if you need anything. And the first time I looked into his face as I walked by and said hello was... It reminded me of what Mother Teresa said, that we see the face of Christ in those in need. The despair I saw in his face when I first walked by was just chilling. And it reminded me again what I mentioned at the beginning and now, that there are many people who are going to be homeless, without homes, and alone. and for us to reach out and to see the face of Christ in someone in need when we walk by or we see on TV, whatever. Anyway, at the end, I asked him I introduced my name. I told him my name, and I asked him what his name was, and he said, it's Jeremy. But he hesitated in telling me, and I don't know if he made it up. I would never embarrass him, but I decided either he was an angel or an angel brought him to me to see the face of Christ. Christ spoke through his face. So I want to leave you with that thought, and hope to see you tomorrow. Tomorrow at tea time we're going to talk about painted portraits, both impressionist and realist. I'll just take 3 or 4, and then tomorrow night, chapter 10. So look forward to seeing you. Thanks for coming by the fireside. I hope you have a wonderful evening. Rob, hi, nice to see you. Thanks so much for checking in. I'll talk to you all later. I can't see all of you who are on, but Debbie, hi, I can see you. Your post, that's all I can see. So thank you all, and have a good night, and hug your family and friends. Amen, and good night. Thanks. Thus endeth the reading. Thanks so much. Thanks be to God.